The millionaire mocked her for being too poor. 2 years later, she returned with the richest billionaire and the twins that silenced the world. Hi, my beautiful family. Welcome back to your own family channel, Mr. Peter Family. May the Almighty wrap every woman in protection stronger than mountains, peace deeper than oceans, and grace that never runs dry. May every battle you've fought open doors of unexpected blessings, and may every tear you've shed be turned into a river of joy and restoration. You are the quiet warrior in loud storms, the gentle strength in heavy moments, and the heartbeat that keeps every home alive. May your steps be guided, your voice be honored, and your spirit never shaken again. My precious family, don't stay silent tonight. Your presence brings light, healing, and unity. A like is a whisper of faith. A comment is a spark of strength. This is Mission 1000 likes, for every woman who still prays, still loves, and still rises. If you carry hope in your heart, like this video. If your spirit walks in grace, comment, I'm with Mr. Peter. The rain hammered against the floor-to-ceiling windows like accusations Binta Queen could no longer defend herself against, each drop a reminder that storms always found her when she had nowhere left to hide. She stood in the marble foyer of the penthouse that had never truly been hers, divorce papers trembling in hands that had once believed they were building a future, and watched her husband of 3 years look at her like she was something he'd scraped off the bottom of his expensive Italian shoes. James Brown adjusted his custom suit jacket with the kind of casual precision that spoke of a man who had forgotten what it felt like to worry about wrinkled clothing or unpaid bills or the cost of anything at all. The disgust on his face was so pure, so complete, that Binta almost admired its honesty. At least now she knew exactly what he thought of her, what he'd probably always thought beneath the early romance and the promises that had turned out to be as substantial as morning fog. "You embarrass me," he said, and his voice carried the weight of a verdict that had been decided long before this moment. Every business dinner, every charity gala, every time I introduce you to someone who matters, I watch them trying not to laugh. You flinch at menu prices like someone's going to make you wash dishes to pay for your meal. You don't know which fork to use, which wine to order, which conversations to avoid. My colleagues mock me behind my back, Binta. They call you my charity project. They ask me when I'm going to trade up to someone who actually belongs in our world. His mother sat on the white leather sofa behind him, adding venom to every wound by reminding Binta that she tried to warn James, that poverty isn't just about money, but about breeding, about knowing your place, about understanding that some people are born to serve and others are born to be served. The older woman's presence made the furniture look like a throne from which judgment was being passed down on the unworthy. The penthouse, every piece of furniture, every painting, every diamond that Binta thought was hers, everything exists only in James's name. She came into this marriage with nothing but love and left her entire life behind to support his dreams, working 3 brutal jobs to help him secure the business loans that built his empire while he was still nobody. She reminds him of the nights she came home at 3 in the morning from her 3rd shift, only to wake at 6 to make him breakfast before his investor meetings, of how she sold her grandmother's only valuable possession to help him make payroll when his company almost collapsed, of how she believed in him when everyone else called him a failure. James looks at her like she's reciting someone else's history. He tells her those were dark, humiliating times he spent years trying to forget, and she represents everything about his past that he needs to bury. His new woman, Rochelle Davis, is already 4 months pregnant and comes from the kind of family that opens doors instead of standing outside them begging for entry. Rochelle understands which charities buy social capital, which country clubs matter, how to make conversation with people who control wealth that can crush or create futures with a single phone call. "You have 1 hour," James says, glancing at his watch like her devastation is an appointment running over schedule. "Take whatever fits in one suitcase. Everything else stays. The clothes I bought you, the jewelry, the phone, the credit cards, all of it was mine anyway. You're leaving the same way you came in, with nothing. Binta moves through the penthouse like a ghost, haunting her own life, packing the few things that had truly been hers. She hears James on the phone making plans with Rochelle for dinner at the restaurant where he'd proposed. She hears his mother telling someone about the upgrade her son is making, how the new girl's father is a congressman and her mother sits on museum boards. She hears the rain and the city and the sound of her own heart breaking so quietly that nobody else would ever know it happened. When she walks out with her suitcase, James appears on the balcony above the entrance. His voice carries down to the street where doormen and neighbors and random strangers can all hear his final gift to the woman he's discarding. Go back to the gutter where you belong, Binta. You were always just a poor girl playing dress-up, pretending you belonged somewhere you never had any right to be. I'm grateful I realized my mistake before you could drag me down to your level. You should be grateful too. At least now you can stop pretending to be something you're not. Binta doesn't cry until 3 blocks away, sitting at a bus stop bench with her suitcase and her entire future reduced to $20 in her purse. The sun starts setting and the city lights come on one by one, and she cries quietly, the way women cry when they've learned that the world doesn't care about their pain and tears are just salt water wasted on soil that grows nothing but bitterness. The last $20 won't get her far. She has no family to call, no friends left after 3 years of James slowly isolating her from everyone who knew her before. She has nothing but the suitcase and the rain and the devastating understanding that she'd given everything to a man who'd thrown her away the moment she'd served her purpose. Chapter 2. 3 years of rebuilding and the walls she built. The hospital hallway smelled like disinfectant and desperation at 4 in the morning, but Binta Queen had learned to find comfort in that combination because it meant she was somewhere James Brown would never think to look for her. 3 years had passed since the divorce, 3 years of running so far from who she'd been that sometimes she couldn't remember that woman at all, and that forgetting felt like the only mercy the universe had shown her since the day she walked out of that penthouse with nothing but shame and a suitcase. She'd rebuilt herself from absolute zero in a new city where nobody knew her story. The overnight shifts at the hospital paid barely enough to cover rent on the studio apartment that smelled like mold and old cigarette smoke. But the night work meant she could take online courses during the day, her laptop balanced on her knees while exhaustion made the words blur together. Sleep became something she stole in 2-hour increments, her body a machine she'd trained to function on coffee and willpower and the cold fury that came from knowing she would never be vulnerable again. The nursing degree came through determination that bordered on obsession. She studied like her life depended on passing every exam, because in the most literal sense possible, it did. Every certification, every skill, every piece of knowledge represented another brick in the fortress she was building around herself. Her classmates tried to befriend her, but Binta shut down their attempts with a coldness that eventually made them stop trying. The moment that cemented her walls came during her 2nd year of nursing school. A patient's husband, visiting during Binta's clinical rotation, decided her professional kindness meant romantic interest. He cornered her in a supply closet, blocking the door with his body, telling her he could see she was lonely, that she needed a real man to take care of her, that his wife didn't need to know. Binta's knee connected with his groin before her conscious mind registered the decision to fight back. She reported him to her supervisor, who looked at her with pity and asked what she'd been wearing, whether she'd been too friendly, whether maybe she'd misunderstood his intentions. The man faced no consequences. His wife's treatment continued uninterrupted, and Binta learned that the world would always find ways to blame women for men's violence, that vulnerability invited exploitation, that the only safety came from being so cold that nobody dared approach. Men were the worst after that. They approached her everywhere with smiles full of confidence that came from never being destroyed by someone they loved, never being cornered in supply closets by married men who thought they could take what they wanted. Binta's rejections became legendary. She didn't make excuses or soften the blow. She simply said no and walked away, and if they persisted, she made it clear that she found their attention insulting. Her supervisor suggested counseling after 6 months of watching Binta move through life like a robot, programmed for efficiency but not feeling. Binta thanked her politely and ignored every suggestion. Therapy meant talking about James, about the supply closet, about all the ways the world had taught her that trust was just another word for future betrayal. But her coldness toward people didn't extend to patience. A night came during her final year of training when a teenager was brought in with massive trauma from a car accident, his body broken in ways that made the attending physicians shake their heads and prepare for inevitable death. Binta spent 6 hours with that boy, her hands steady while she controlled bleeding, managed airways, anticipated every complication before monitors could scream warnings. She refused to let him die. She fought for his life with the same ferocity she used to protect herself from emotional connection. And when his heart kept beating past the hour, doctors said it would stop. When his vitals stabilized against all probability, the supervising physician told her she'd just witnessed her calling. Some nurses were good with people, some were good with medicine. Binta Queen was good at refusing to let death win, and that skill would save more lives than compassion ever could. The nursing degree came with honors that Binta accepted without pride or satisfaction. The job offers came from multiple hospitals, and she chose the one furthest from where she'd lived with James. The pay was good enough for a better apartment, but Binta barely noticed her surroundings anymore. Her co-workers tried friendly approaches and received the same cold shutdowns. The other nurses started calling her the Ice Queen behind her back, and when Binta overheard the nickname, she smiled for the first time in months. Ice was strong. Ice was impenetrable. Ice kept people alive when warmth would have let them slip away. One younger nurse made the mistake of trying to set Binta up on a blind date. Binta's response was so cutting, so filled with barely controlled rage, that the woman never mentioned it again. Binta's hatred for men wasn't loud or dramatic. It was cold and absolute. She looked at happy couples and saw lies waiting to be exposed. She looked at wedding rings and saw chains disguised as jewelry. She looked at romance and saw manipulation waiting to happen, saw supply closets and blocked doors, and men who thought loneliness made women easy targets. But excellence had consequences. Her patient care ratings were the highest in the hospital. The administrators promoted her, gave her responsibilities usually reserved for nurses with decades more experience. She became the nurse they called when patients were circling the drain, when families needed someone who wouldn't sugarcoat terrible news, when dying people needed someone strong enough to witness their fear without flinching. Binta accepted everything with mechanical efficiency, building a reputation on competence while her emotional life remained frozen. 3 years after the divorce, Binta received an offer from one of the most prestigious hospitals in the country. The position came with significant salary increase and the opportunity to work in a state-of-the-art facility. The hospital was in yet another city, even further from her past, and Binta accepted within hours. She packed without nostalgia and drove toward her new life with the same cold determination that had carried her through the last 3 years. The apartment in the new city was nicer than anywhere she'd lived before, with actual sunlight and a kitchen that worked properly. She furnished it with bare minimum and felt nothing about the accomplishment. She stood in her empty living room on her first night, surrounded by boxes she had no energy to unpack, and realized she'd successfully built a life where nothing could hurt her because nothing could reach her. The woman who'd believed in love and partnership and building futures together was dead. In her place stood someone who saved lives professionally but couldn't save herself from the prison she'd built to survive, and she told herself that was enough, that survival was victory, that feeling nothing was better than risking feeling everything and having it destroy you again. Chapter 3. The billionaire who saw through the walls. The pediatric ward gleamed with fresh paint and expensive equipment, and Binta Queen moved through it with the efficient detachment she'd perfected over years of refusing to let anything touch her. She'd been working at the prestigious hospital for 6 months, long enough to establish her reputation as the nurse who never smiled but always delivered exceptional care. The morning started like every other morning, and nothing suggested today would be different from the hundreds of identical days that had come before it. Then Liam Wright walked into the pediatric ward, and everything Binta had built to protect herself became significantly more difficult to maintain. She'd seen his face on magazine covers, but photographs didn't capture the way he moved through space with subtle confidence that wasn't about his wealth, but something deeper. He was surrounded by the hospital's board of directors, all performing the particular kind of obsequious attention that rich people inspired, but Liam seemed barely aware of their presence. What struck Binta immediately was that he stopped to pick up a dropped toy car in the hallway, crouching down to return it to a small boy with a bald head and an IV pole, taking time to admire the car like it was a vintage collector's item instead of plastic worth $2. The head nurse was out sick, which meant Binta had been assigned to give the tour of the new wing that Liam's foundation had funded. She approached it with professional competence and absolutely zero personal investment. She introduced herself without warmth, outlined the tour route without enthusiasm, and began walking without checking to see if anyone was following. Liam asked intelligent questions about the equipment, about patient capacity, about how the design would improve care. But his questions weren't the typical donor questions about costs and efficiency. He asked about how the layout would reduce nurse fatigue, whether the lighting would help or harm patients with sensory processing issues, if the play areas were designed with input from actual children or just adults guessing what children wanted. Binta answered each question with minimum information required, never elaborating, never engaging beyond what professionalism demanded. She could feel him watching her, studying her with attention that made her skin prickle with warning. They stopped at the window of the neonatal intensive care unit. One of the board members started explaining mortality rate statistics, clearly trying to impress Liam with numbers that demonstrated the hospital's excellence. But Liam's attention had drifted to a young mother sitting beside an incubator, her hand pressed against glass, separating her from a baby too small to survive outside that carefully controlled environment. The woman was alone, no partner visible, no family members offering support, just her and the impossibly tiny baby fighting for life in a plastic box. Without a word to the board members mid-sentence, Liam walked into the NICU. The board members looked at each other in confusion, unsure whether to follow or wait. Binta followed because that was her job, watching as Liam approached the young mother and asked if she was okay. The woman looked up with hollow eyes of someone who hadn't slept in days, who was running on adrenaline and prayer, and the desperate hope that willpower could somehow influence medical outcomes. She started crying, and Liam sat beside her in the uncomfortable plastic chair, not seeming to care that his expensive suit would wrinkle or that he was supposed to be touring facilities with important hospital administrators. She talked about her baby's chances, how the doctors gave her percentages that felt like death sentences, how her insurance would cover basic care but not the experimental treatments that might actually help, how she'd already maxed out credit cards and borrowed from everyone she knew. Binta had heard variations of this story hundreds of times. The healthcare system was designed to bankrupt people at their most vulnerable, and she'd stopped being surprised by the cruelty years ago. But what happened next did surprise her. Liam didn't offer empty sympathy or vague promises. He pulled out his phone and made a call to someone named Patricia in his foundation office. Binta heard enough to understand he was instructing his foundation to cover all medical expenses for this woman's baby, including experimental treatments doctors recommended, and to establish a trust fund providing financial support for the family regardless of outcome. The young mother sobbed harder, and Liam simply held her hand until she could breathe again. When she asked how she could ever repay this kindness, Liam told her the only payment he wanted was for her to do the same for someone else when she had the chance, to build a chain of compassion that outlasted all of them. Something in Binta's carefully constructed armor cracked just slightly, not enough to be dangerous, just enough to be uncomfortable. She'd seen wealthy people tour hospitals before, watched them write checks that meant nothing to their bank accounts while feeling like heroes. But Liam's gesture came with no cameras, no press releases, no requests for naming rights, just a mother who wouldn't lose her baby because she couldn't afford to save him. The tour continued, and Binta watched Liam stop to talk to every sick child they passed. He crouched down to their eye level, asked about their favorite superheroes and video games, made terrible jokes that shouldn't have been funny, but somehow made children laugh despite their pain. He remembered every name after being told once, asking follow-up questions that proved he was actually listening instead of performing caring. He noticed a girl sitting alone in her room staring out the window and asked Binta why she had no visitors. Terminal illness, Binta explained flatly. Parents couldn't handle watching her die, so they stopped coming. Liam spent 20 minutes with that girl talking about her drawings, promising to bring her better art supplies on his next visit, treating her like her remaining time mattered instead of like someone already gone. And through it all, Binta felt him watching her whenever he thought she wasn't paying attention. Not with the predatory assessment she'd learned to recognize from men who saw her isolation as opportunity. With something else, curiosity maybe, or recognition. Like he saw through her professional mask to the fortress underneath and found it interesting instead of intimidating. When the tour ended, Liam thanked her with genuine warmth that most people reserve for friends rather than staff. Then he asked if she'd be willing to have coffee to discuss ways his foundation could better support the hospital's programs. It was phrased as a professional request, but Binta heard the personal interest underneath, recognized the tactic of wrapping desire in business legitimacy. "I don't have coffee with donors," she said, her voice flat and final. "If you want to discuss foundation matters, speak with the hospital administrators. My job is patient care, not fundraising." She walked away without waiting for his response, her heart beating faster than she wanted to admit. But Liam Wright didn't disappear like other rejected men. He came back the following week, and the week after that, always finding reasons to visit the pediatric wing. He kept his promise to the girl with no visitors, bringing expensive art supplies and spending lunch hours sitting with her while she drew. He followed up on the baby in the NICU, asking Binta about his progress, seeming genuinely invested in whether the experimental treatment was working. He asked her about her background and she gave minimum information. He tried to engage her in conversations beyond hospital business, and she redirected him every time. He asked her to coffee, to lunch, to accompany him to a medical conference, and every time she declined without explanation. Most men would have been discouraged, but Liam's interest shifted to something more subtle and therefore more dangerous. Small gifts started appearing. Books she'd been reading on her breaks suddenly waiting for her with no note attached. Her favorite coffee order appearing at her workstation when she was too busy to get it herself. Donations to causes she'd mentioned caring about showing up on the hospital bulletin board. Binta knew who was behind the gestures, and the knowledge made her furious because thoughtfulness was harder to dismiss than aggressive pursuit. She found him in the parking lot one evening, waiting by his car in the cold, and confronted him with barely controlled rage masking fear underneath. Her voice shook when she told him she wasn't interested, would never be interested, and if he continued this behavior, she would file a formal complaint with the hospital and his foundation board. She told him that his wealth didn't give him the right to pursue women who'd made their disinterest clear, that she didn't care how many sick children he helped or medical bills he paid. None of it meant she owed him her time or attention or anything at all. Liam listened to her verbal assault without interrupting, without defending himself, without any of the anger she'd expected from a man accustomed to getting what he wanted. When she finished, Breathing hard from adrenaline and suppressed fear, he simply nodded and said he understood she'd been hurt before, that whatever happened had clearly been devastating, but not every man was the same man who'd hurt her. He promised to stop if she truly wanted him to, but he asked her to at least consider that good men existed, even if she never wanted to be with him specifically. "I'm not asking you to trust me," he said quietly. "I'm asking you to consider the possibility that you're punishing yourself for someone else's cruelty, and that maybe you deserve better than to spend the rest of your life alone because one person proved unworthy of what you offered him." Binta walked away without responding, her hands shaking, her throat tight, her carefully constructed walls cracking in ways that terrified her more than his pursuit ever could. Because he was right. She was punishing herself. She'd given James Brown so much power over her future that even 7 years after their divorce, he was still controlling her life by making her too afraid to live it. That night, for the first time since the divorce, Binta cried not from pain, but from confusion. Because a small, terrifying part of her had wanted to say yes to coffee, to conversation, to the possibility that maybe this man was different. And that desire felt like betrayal of everything she'd built to survive, like weakness creeping back in when she'd worked so hard to become strong, like the first crack in a dam that held back an ocean of vulnerability she couldn't afford to drown in again. Chapter 4. The Friendship That Changed Everything. 8 months had passed since the parking lot confrontation, and Liam Wright had kept his word in ways that made Binta Queen simultaneously grateful and unsettled. He still visited the hospital regularly, still funded programs and covered medical expenses for struggling families, but he maintained careful distance from Binta herself. No more gifts, no more extended conversations, no more invitations. He'd respected her boundaries completely, and Binta found herself disappointed by his absence, which made her angry at herself for caring. The shift happened on a Tuesday night, when a 7-year-old girl named Maya didn't survive surgery. Binta had spent weeks caring for her, watching her fight with the kind of courage that made adults look cowardly by comparison. And when the monitors flatlined and the doctors called time of death, something inside Binta broke in ways her professional training couldn't contain. She finished her shift on autopilot, her body going through motions while her mind replayed Maya's laugh and the way she'd asked Binta if heaven had good Wi-Fi because she wanted to keep playing her favorite game. Maya had been alone when she died. Her parents had been in a car accident rushing to the hospital, stuck in emergency surgery themselves in another wing. The girl had squeezed Binta's hand and asked her to tell her parents she wasn't scared, that the nice nurse stayed with her, that dying didn't hurt as much as being sick had. Binta had promised to deliver the message, had held that small hand until it went limp, had felt something fundamental crack inside her chest that no amount of professional detachment could prevent. The hospital chapel at 2 a.m. was empty, except for Binta sitting in the last pew, staring at stained glass windows that looked black in the darkness. She wasn't praying because she'd stopped believing in anything that required faith years ago. She was just sitting because going home to her empty apartment felt impossible, and staying in the pediatric ward where Maya's empty bed waited felt worse. "I thought I might find you here." Liam's voice came from behind her, quiet and careful. Binta turned to see him standing in the doorway, still in his suit from whatever business had kept him working this late. "I heard about Maya. I'm sorry." Binta should have told him to leave, should have maintained the distance she'd fought so hard to establish. But grief had stripped away her defenses, and when Liam asked if he could sit with her, she found herself nodding. They sat in silence for nearly an hour, both too raw to pretend they were fine, before Liam spoke about how hard it was to fund hospitals and know that all the money in the world couldn't save everyone. "Healing and saving aren't always the same thing," Binta heard herself saying. "Sometimes the best care is just being present while someone dies with dignity. Maya didn't die afraid or alone or in pain. That matters." "Does it?" Liam's question wasn't challenging, just genuine curiosity from someone trying to understand. "Does it matter enough to balance out the fact that she's dead at 7 years old?" No, Binta admitted, her voice cracking. Nothing balances that out. But we can't save everyone, so we do what we can. We make the time they have less terrible. We give them moments of joy between the pain. We hold their hands when they're scared. It's not enough. It's never enough. But it's what we have. That conversation led to coffee in the 24-hour diner across from the hospital at 3 in the morning. They talked about death and meaning and whether consciousness could exist without physical form. They argued about whether optimism was wisdom or delusion, whether hope helped or hurt when outcomes were inevitable, whether believing in good people was brave or stupid after the world proved most people were neither wholly good nor wholly bad. Binta found herself defending positions she didn't entirely believe, just to see how Liam would respond, and discovered he did the same thing. They debated like people who loved ideas more than being right, who found intellectual sparring intimate in ways physical touch could never achieve. When the sun started rising and their coffee had gone cold hours ago, Liam walked her to her car and asked if they could do this again. Not a date. Just conversation between two people who discovered they enjoyed each other's minds. Binta said yes before she could talk herself out of it. That yes led to weekly late-night conversations that became the highlight of Binta's otherwise mechanical existence. They watched terrible action movies at his penthouse, both of them sitting on opposite ends of his massive couch, shouting commentary at the screen about plot holes and physics violations. They had long dinners at quiet restaurants where they debated everything from consciousness to politics to whether artificial intelligence could ever truly understand human suffering. They texted random observations throughout the day, casual communication that felt intimate specifically because it wasn't trying to be. 3 months into their friendship, Liam invited Binta to a medical conference where he was speaking about healthcare funding models. She almost declined out of habit, but curiosity won. The conference was in another city, which meant traveling together, which felt dangerously close to something more than friendship. But Liam maintained perfect boundaries, booking separate hotel rooms, treating her like a colleague whose opinion he valued rather than a woman he was trying to pursue. His speech was brilliant, challenging the audience of wealthy donors to stop treating healthcare philanthropy like a tax write-off and start thinking about systemic change. He quoted statistics Binta had mentioned in their conversations, credited her perspective without naming her publicly, and when audience members asked questions he couldn't answer, he looked to her in the crowd and asked if she wanted to address them. Binta found herself standing up, speaking to hundreds of healthcare administrators and donors about gaps in care she'd witnessed, about patients who died because they couldn't afford treatment, about how the current system was designed to bankrupt people at their most vulnerable. After the speech, during the cocktail reception Binta normally would have avoided, she watched wealthy donors approach Liam with checkbooks ready. But instead of just taking their money, he directed them to specific programs that needed funding, introduced them to hospital administrators who could explain exactly how donations would be used, made sure they understood they were investing in solutions rather than just easing their conscience. This was what his wealth meant to him, Binta realized. Not power or status, or the ability to have whatever he wanted. It was a tool for fixing systems that hurt people like her, like the patients she'd lost, like Maya who died because her parents couldn't afford the experimental treatment that might have saved her. The flight home was delayed by weather, and they ended up spending 4 hours in the airport talking about their childhoods. Liam told her about growing up wealthy but lonely, about parents who provided everything except presents, about building his company partially to prove he could create something meaningful instead of just inheriting money. Binta found herself sharing more than she'd intended, talking about growing up poor but loved, about her grandmother who'd raised her after her parents died, about learning early that the world was divided into people who had resources and people who needed them. "That ring you sold for James," Liam said carefully. "The one from your grandmother. Do you ever regret that?" "Every day," Binta admitted. "Not because I want it back, but because I gave it to someone who didn't value what it represented. My grandmother wore that ring for 60 years. It survived poverty and immigration and raising children alone after my grandfather died. It was supposed to go to me on my wedding day, but I sold it to make James's payroll because I believed in him more than I believed in jewelry, and he threw me away anyway. I'm sorry, Liam said, and the way he said it made Binta believe he actually understood the depth of that loss. 6 months into their friendship, a patient's family member recognized Liam in the hospital corridor and started thanking him effusively for covering their mother's cancer treatment. The man was crying, talking about how his family had been facing bankruptcy before Liam's foundation stepped in, how his children would be able to go to college now, how he'd never be able to repay this kindness. Liam looked genuinely uncomfortable with the gratitude, redirecting the man's thanks toward the medical team who'd actually saved his mother. After the man left, Binta studied Liam carefully. How many families have you done that for? I don't keep count, Liam said, not meeting her eyes. What's the point of having money if you can't use it to ease suffering? Most rich people don't think that way. Most rich people are using wealth to fill voids in themselves instead of addressing why the voids exist in the first place. He turned to look at her then, his expression serious. You do the same thing I do, Binta. You just use your time and skill instead of money. You stay late with dying patients so they don't face death alone. You fight administrators for better care when it would be easier to just follow protocols. You give pieces of yourself to strangers because you can't stand watching people suffer when you have the power to help. We're the same in the ways that matter. Something shifted between them in that moment. Not romance, not yet, but recognition. They were both using their resources to fight against the cruelty they'd experienced in different forms, both trying to prove that the world could be better than it had been to them. That recognition became the foundation of trust Binta hadn't known she was capable of building again. A year into their friendship, they had a patient crisis that required both of them. A teenage boy needed experimental treatment that wasn't FDA approved in the United States, but was showing promising results in other countries. The hospital administration refused to get involved due to liability concerns. The boy's family couldn't afford to travel internationally for treatment. The boy had weeks, maybe a month, before the cancer spreading through his body would make any treatment impossible. Binta and Liam spent 72 hours finding a solution. Liam's foundation funded the family's travel and treatment abroad, while Binta coordinated with international medical teams to ensure continuity of care, burning through favors and connections she'd built over years of networking. They worked together seamlessly, anticipating each other's thoughts, dividing responsibilities without discussion, operating like a team that had been practicing this dance for decades instead of months. When the boy was safely in treatment overseas and early reports showed he was responding well, Binta and Liam collapsed in the hospital cafeteria at midnight, exhausted and running on adrenaline. Liam reached across the table and took her hand, and Binta didn't pull away. They sat like that for a long time, holding hands across terrible cafeteria coffee, both knowing something had fundamentally changed between them, but neither ready to name it yet. Thank you, the boy's mother had said before they left for the airport, hugging both Binta and Liam with desperate gratitude. You gave my son a future. I'll never be able to repay that. Teach him to do the same for someone else, Binta had said. That's the only payment we need. That night, Binta went home and lay awake, realizing she'd let Liam past walls she'd sworn would never come down. She'd shared her history and her fears and her desperate hope that the world could be better than it had been. She'd worked beside him as a true partner, trusting his judgment and his intentions in ways she hadn't trusted anyone since before James destroyed her ability to trust. And instead of terrifying her completely, it felt almost like relief. Like maybe she'd been wrong about men and walls and the necessity of isolation. Like maybe, just maybe, there were people in the world who could be trusted with vulnerability, and Liam Wright might be one of them. She picked up her phone and texted him, "Thank you for being patient with me." His response came immediately, "Thank you for letting me try." Binta fell asleep that night with her phone still in her hand, feeling something she hadn't felt in 7 years. Not quite hope, because hope still felt too dangerous, but possibility. The possibility that maybe she could have connection without destruction, partnership without possession, friendship that might eventually become something more if she could just find the courage to keep choosing vulnerability over safety. Chapter 5. The Proposal That Broke Through the Walls. 18 months into their friendship, Binta Queen received a call at 2 in the morning that Liam Wright had been in a car accident. The hospital staff assured her he was fine, just being held for observation after another driver ran a red light and sideswiped his car. But Binta was in her vehicle and driving before her conscious mind fully processed what she was doing. She arrived at the emergency department still in her pajamas, her heart racing with a terror that had nothing to do with professional concern and everything to do with the devastating realization that losing Liam would destroy her in ways she'd sworn never to risk again. She found him sitting on an examination table, arguing with a doctor about whether he needed to stay overnight for observation. He had a cut above his eyebrow that had been bandaged and bruising already forming along his jaw, but he was alert and arguing, which meant he was fine. When he saw Binta standing in the doorway in her pajamas and ratty cardigan, something in his expression shifted from frustrated to soft. "You came," he said, like it was the most important thing that had happened all night, more significant than the accident or the injuries or the totaled car outside. "Of course I came," Binta snapped, her fear translating to anger the way it always did when she felt too much too quickly. "You called me." "I didn't call you. The hospital called you as my emergency contact." Binta froze. She'd forgotten that she'd agreed to be his emergency contact 6 months ago when he'd updated his paperwork. A casual request she'd agreed to because it seemed practical and low stakes. But standing here now, looking at him bruised and bandaged, and looking at her like she was the most important person in his world, practical felt like an inadequate description for what had been building between them for nearly 2 years. The doctor finished the examination and left them alone with instructions for Liam to rest and follow up if symptoms worsened. Binta moved closer, her hands hovering near his face, like she wanted to touch him, but couldn't quite give herself permission. Liam caught one of her hands and pulled it to his cheek, pressing her palm against his skin with an intensity that made her breath catch. "I thought about you," he said quietly. "When the other car hit us and everything spun and I didn't know if I was going to walk away from it. I thought about you and how I'd never told you the truth about how I feel, and I was furious at myself for wasting time being patient when life doesn't guarantee us enough time for patience." "Liam, don't... I love you, Binta." The words came out steady and certain despite the chaos of the night. "I've been in love with you since I watched you fight a hospital administrator for better pain management for a patient who couldn't advocate for herself. I love the way your mind works, the way you argue about consciousness and meaning like philosophy actually matters in the real world. I love how you give everything to your patients and nothing to yourself. I love your walls and your scars and the strength it took to survive what tried to break you. I love you with a certainty that terrifies me because I've never felt this way about anyone, and I'm tired of pretending friendship is enough when what I want is forever." Binta's hands were shaking. Her breath came short. Every instinct she'd developed screamed at her to run, to shut this down, to rebuild walls that Liam had somehow managed to dismantle brick by brick over months of conversations and shared purpose and the kind of partnership that made her forget why she'd been so afraid of partnership in the first place. "I can't," she whispered, but it sounded like a lie even to her own ears. "You can," Liam said, pulling her closer until she was standing between his legs where he sat on the examination table. You're the bravest person I know, Binta. You rebuilt yourself from nothing. You turned devastation into purpose and pain into compassion. You can be brave enough for this too, for us, unless you genuinely don't feel the same way, in which case I'll accept that and we'll figure out how to stay friends, because I'd rather have you in my life in any capacity than not have you at all. That's the problem, Binta said, tears streaming down her face now despite her attempts to maintain control. I do feel the same way. I'm terrified of how much I feel for you, of how completely you've gotten past every defense I built, of how much power you have to destroy me if this doesn't work. I barely survived being destroyed once. I don't know if I could survive it again. Then let me prove you can trust this, Liam said, wiping tears from her cheeks with his thumbs. Let me prove that what we have is real and solid and worth the risk. Marry me, Binta. Not because I need to possess you or own you or any of the things that made your first marriage a prison. Marry me because we're better together than apart, because partnership means building each other up, because I want to spend my life proving that love can heal instead of destroy. Binta looked at him for a long moment, at this man who'd spent 2 years respecting her boundaries, while simultaneously showing her through actions that not all men were James, that not all love ended in devastation, that sometimes taking the terrifying leap actually led somewhere beautiful instead of another impact that shattered everything. She thought about Maya and the other patients she'd lost, about how life didn't guarantee enough time for patience, about how spending the rest of her life running from vulnerability meant spending it alone with walls that protected nothing because there was nothing left inside them worth protecting. Yes, she whispered, the word barely audible but carrying the weight of the most important decision she'd made since choosing to rebuild herself. Yes, I'll marry you. Yes, I'm terrified, but I'm saying yes anyway because you're right. I deserve better than to spend my entire life alone because one person proved unworthy of what I offered him. Liam pulled her into his arms and held her while she cried harder than she'd cried since the divorce. But these weren't tears of pain or fear. These were tears of relief, of letting go, of choosing vulnerability and discovering that sometimes the scariest choices led to the most beautiful destinations. They stayed in that emergency room exam room until sunrise, holding each other like people who'd found something infinitely precious and were determined never to let it go. When they finally left the hospital, Liam pulled a ring box from his jacket pocket that he'd apparently been carrying for months, waiting for the right moment. The ring was simple and perfect, and when he slid it onto her finger in the hospital parking lot with the sun rising behind them, Binta felt like she was finally, completely, irreversibly free from the past that had tried so hard to define her forever. She was choosing her future. She was choosing love. She was choosing to believe that not all endings were destruction, that sometimes endings were actually beginnings disguised as something else entirely. Chapter 6. The wedding and the extreme love that rewrote everything the garden transformed into something otherworldly. As late afternoon became evening, fairy lights strung through ancient oak trees, creating constellations that rivaled the stars beginning to appear in the darkening sky. Binta Queen stood in the doorway looking out at the chairs arranged in semicircles and the people already gathering, and felt her breath catch with the terrifying realization that this was actually happening, that in less than an hour she would be married again, that she was choosing to do this, despite every lesson her first marriage had taught her about the dangers of trusting someone with your entire future. The small gathering represented something Binta had never experienced in her first wedding, people who actually knew her and wanted to celebrate her happiness. Liam's family had arrived early, his mother pulling Binta aside to say she'd gained a daughter today, that watching them together made her believe in love again after her own divorce had made her cynical. His sister had brought wildflowers instead of expensive roses because she'd remembered Binta mentioning her grandmother used to pick them on walks. His father asked permission to walk her down the aisle since her grandmother had passed, and when Binta started crying, he simply hugged her and said family was about who showed up, not who shared DNA. Standing in her simple white dress, Holding Liam's hands while sunset painted the sky in gold and rose, Binta made vows she actually believed. "I promise to choose you every day. Not just on the days when choosing you is easy, but on the days when my trauma tries to convince me that running is safer than staying. I promise to tell you when I'm scared instead of pretending I'm fine. I promise to be brave enough to accept the happiness you're offering me, even though accepting it means risking the kind of pain I've spent years protecting myself from." Liam's vows were simpler, but somehow more devastating. "I promise to earn your trust every single day for the rest of our lives. I promise that when you doubt yourself, I'll remind you of your strength. I promise to see you for who you actually are, not who I want you to be or who you think you should be. And I promise to love you not despite your scars, but because they're part of the whole extraordinary person standing in front of me." When they kissed as husband and wife, Binta heard the small gathering applaud. But the sound felt distant compared to the feeling of Liam's lips on hers, the reality settling into her bones that she'd actually chosen trust over fear, vulnerability over safety, hope over the certainty of loneliness. The first 3 months of marriage were an education in unlearning. Binta had to unlearn the expectation that kindness came with conditions, that affection was currency to be earned, that her value was measured by how little trouble she caused. The lesson arrived in small moments. Liam asking her opinion about paint colors and actually using her suggestion. Liam cancelling a business dinner because she'd had a brutal shift and needed him home. Liam learning to make her grandmother's chicken soup even though his first 3 attempts were disasters that made them order takeout while laughing. But the hardest lesson came 4 months into marriage, when Binta made a mistake at work that cost a patient an extra day of pain. She came home devastated, spiraling into self-hatred that James had cultivated in her by constantly pointing out her inadequacies. She sat in their bedroom closet, hiding like a child, waiting for Liam to confirm what she already knew, that she was incompetent, that she didn't belong in nursing, that she ruined everything she touched. Liam found her there 2 hours later. He didn't minimize her pain. He sat down on the closet floor beside her and said the patient was fine now, that mistakes happened to every medical professional, that her value wasn't measured by perfection, but by how she responded when things went wrong. Then he asked what she needed from him, and when she said she needed him to just sit with her while she felt terrible, he did exactly that. No judgment, no impatience, just presence. Their physical relationship evolved through stages that required conscious navigation of Binta's trauma responses. The wedding night had been tender and careful, both nervous despite months of being engaged, both aware they were crossing a threshold that changed everything. Liam asked permission for every touch, every progression, stopping when she tensed, even if she hadn't said anything. That first time had been more about trust than pleasure, proving to Binta that intimacy could be different from what she'd experienced with James, who'd treated her body like property he owned. But as weeks became months, and Binta's trust solidified through repeated proof that Liam meant what he said, their connection deepened into something that felt almost sacred. There were nights when they made love with urgency, born of gratitude that they'd found each other, that Binta had been brave enough to say yes. Liam explored her body with the attention of someone memorizing geography he'd been granted access to, discovering what made her breath catch, what made her feel safe enough to ask for what she wanted. 6 months into marriage, Binta woke from a nightmare about James, with desperate need for reassurance that she was here, now, in this marriage, with this man who chose her daily. They'd made love in the darkness, Binta clinging to Liam with intensity that had nothing to do with desire and everything to do with needing to feel safe, needing to replace old memories with new ones. Liam taught her that asking for what she needed wasn't weakness, but communication, that intimacy could be playful instead of fraught, that her pleasure mattered as much as his. The pregnancy test was positive 9 months into their marriage, and Binta stared at the two pink lines, feeling like the universe had just handed her a gift she hadn't known she wanted. She'd been sitting on their bathroom counter for 20 minutes when Liam knocked on the door asking if she was okay. She opened the door and held up the test without saying anything, watching his face transform from concern to confusion to understanding to joy so pure it made her chest ache. He picked her up and held her while she tried to explain all the emotions crashing through her. Excitement that they were going to be parents, terror that she'd somehow damage their child, hope that maybe she could give their baby the childhood she'd wished she'd had. "We're going to figure this out together," Liam said, the same promise he'd made when he proposed. "You're not doing this alone." The 8-week ultrasound revealed twins, and Binta had laughed so hard she cried because, of course, her body would create 2 babies at once, because nothing in her life had ever been simple. The pregnancy was physically brutal. Morning sickness that lasted all day for the entire first trimester, her body rebelling against the hormones and the changes. Liam started working from home more frequently, making sure she ate even when nausea made food repulsive, talking to her stomach during the 2nd trimester, telling their sons about the world they'd be born into. The conversation about names happened during month 7. They were lying in bed, Liam's hand on her stomach feeling the twins move when Binta said what she'd been thinking about for weeks. "I want to name one of them James." The silence that followed felt loaded with all the history that name carried. Liam's hand stilled on her belly. "Tell me why," he said finally. "Because James Brown tried to make that name synonymous with my shame," Binta said, her hand covering Liam's. "Every time someone said James, I flinched. But if I name our son James, if I watch him grow up loved and secure, then the name stops being a weapon someone used against me and becomes a declaration of victory. I survived. I healed. I built something beautiful. And every time I call my son's name, I'll be reminded that the person who tried to break me failed completely." Liam was quiet for a long moment. "Our son is going to grow up knowing he has the strongest mother in the world," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "And you're going to teach him that survival isn't just about enduring, it's about transforming what tried to destroy you into something that makes you stronger." "And Harry for the 2nd one," Binta said. "After your grandfather. You said he was the kind of man who made everyone around him better just by being himself. That's what I want for our sons." The labor started 3 weeks before her due date, sharp contractions that woke her at dawn. Liam called her doctor, packed the hospital bag, and drove them with careful attention that made Binta feel both protected and capable. 17 hours later, exhausted and convinced she couldn't push anymore, Binta heard the first cry that announced James's arrival. They placed him on her chest immediately, all vernix covered and furious, and Binta felt something crack open in her chest that had been sealed since her grandmother died. This was love without conditions, fierce and protective and absolute. Harry arrived 12 minutes later, smaller than his brother, but just as angry about the transition. They placed him beside James on Binta's chest, and she looked down at her sons with tears streaming, overwhelmed that she'd created these perfect beings, that she was responsible for keeping them alive and helping them grow into good men who treated people with kindness. That night, after visitors left and nurses dimmed the lights, Binta held James while Liam held Harry, both staring at their sons with exhausted contentment. The twins slept peacefully, unaware that their existence represented their mother's greatest victory. Proof that surviving devastation wasn't just about enduring, it was about building something so beautiful from the ashes that the fire that tried to destroy you became the forge that made you stronger than you ever knew you could be. Chapter 7. The Empire, the Twins, and the Woman. She never thought she could become 3 years into motherhood. Binta Wright stood at the floor-to-ceiling windows of her medical foundation's headquarters, watching the city wake up beneath her, and marveled at how completely unrecognizable her life had become from the woman who'd sat at that bus stop with one suitcase and $20, believing she'd never trust or hope or love again. James and Harry were at home with their nanny, probably already awake and demanding breakfast with the enthusiastic chaos only 3-year-olds could generate, and Liam was on a business call in his home office, managing empires while simultaneously being present for their sons. The foundation had grown beyond anything she'd imagined. They'd opened 12 clinics across 5 states, providing comprehensive healthcare to communities systematically denied access to quality medical services. They'd hired over 300 staff members, most from the same underserved communities they were serving. They'd successfully lobbied for policy changes that expanded healthcare access and forced insurance companies to stop treating poor people's illnesses as acceptable losses on profit spreadsheets. Binta's reputation had grown alongside the foundation's success. She spoke at medical conferences and political rallies with equal comfort, her voice carrying the authority of someone who'd lived the statistics she was citing. Politicians courted her endorsement. Medical schools invited her to give commencement speeches. News outlets profiled her as a healthcare revolutionary who'd built an empire of compassion that rivaled her husband's business empire in impact. The twins had changed everything. Watching Liam with James and Harry, seeing how gentle and patient and completely present he was with their sons, healed something deep inside her she'd thought was permanently broken. He changed diapers at 3 in the morning without complaint. He played endless games of chase with enthusiasm that never felt forced. He sang terrible off-key lullabies that somehow worked better than any perfect melody. He was building childhood memories for their sons that looked nothing like the harsh survival of Binta's own early years. Motherhood still terrified her sometimes. She worried about passing her fears and walls onto innocent children who deserved better. But Liam reminded her regularly that being aware of her baggage meant she could actively choose not to burden James and Harry with it. That consciousness and choice were the differences between repeating cycles and breaking them. The love between Binta and Liam had only deepened as years passed and life got more complicated. They still fought sometimes, but they'd learned to fight fair, to listen even when angry, to separate present conflicts from past wounds. They still made time for each other, despite the chaos of running empires and raising toddlers. Stolen moments of intimacy that reminded them both why they'd chosen this partnership. Their physical connection remained intense and necessary. Late nights, when the twins were finally asleep, and they could rediscover each other with the kind of passion that had only grown stronger with time and trust. The moment came at a charity gala where Binta was being honored for her foundation's work, standing beside Liam in a dress that cost more than she'd earned in entire years during her previous life, surrounded by the kind of wealth and power that used to make her feel like an imposter but now felt like natural habitat. Someone mentioned a millionaire who'd lost everything in a series of bad investments and personal scandals, and the name James Brown floated past Binta's consciousness like a ghost she'd successfully exorcised. She froze for just a moment, her hand tightening on Liam's arm, her breath catching. James had fallen. The empire she'd helped him build had crumbled. Part of her waited for satisfaction or vindication. But nothing came. No triumph. No bitterness. Just numbness that felt like the most complete form of moving on possible. Liam felt her tension and looked at her with concern that didn't require explanation. She simply shook her head slightly and redirected her attention to the gala, to the speeches being made about her foundation's impact, to the donors pledging support. James Brown's failure had nothing to do with her success. His fall hadn't lifted her up. She'd climbed on her own strength. He was irrelevant to her story now, except as the catalyst that had forced her to discover strength she hadn't known she possessed. That night, after the gala ended and they returned home to find their sons sleeping peacefully, Binta told Liam about hearing James's name and feeling nothing. She told him how strange it was to realize that the man who'd defined her pain for so long had become so completely insignificant that his suffering didn't even register. Liam held her in their bedroom while city lights filtered through windows. He told her he was proud of her for healing, for building this life, for being brave enough to trust him when every instinct screamed that trust would destroy her. He told her that James and Harry were lucky to have her as their mother, that he was lucky to have her as his wife, that the Foundation's patients were lucky to have her as their advocate. He told her she was extraordinary not despite her scars, but because of them. Binta fell asleep that night feeling more at peace than she'd felt since before her first marriage, secure in the knowledge that she'd successfully outrun her past and built a future worth protecting. The walls she'd constructed over years of survival had finally come down completely, replaced by boundaries that were healthy instead of defensive. She'd learned that love didn't have to destroy you if you chose the right person to love. That partnership could mean building each other up. That vulnerability and strength weren't opposites, but complementary parts of being fully human. She never imagined that within months her past would show up at her office door begging for help, that the final confrontation she'd never wanted would become necessary for complete closure. But that night, sleeping beside Liam with their son safe in the next room and her foundation expanding to serve even more communities, Binta believed her story with James Brown was finished. Chapter 8. The Parallel Descent and the Ruins of Everything He Built. James Brown stood in the apartment that used to be a penthouse but had been downgraded twice until it became just another expensive box he could barely afford, surrounded by eviction notices and bankruptcy warnings and physical evidence that empires built on cruelty eventually collapsed under their own weight. The view showed nothing but other buildings blocking what used to be a cityscape he'd felt like he owned. And even that diminished view would disappear soon because the landlord had made clear that this month's unpaid rent was the last one he'd tolerate. The collapse had been slow enough that James convinced himself for years he could reverse it, that one good investment would restore everything. But looking back from the wreckage of his life, he could see how each disaster had built inevitably on the previous one, dominoes falling in patterns he'd been too arrogant to recognize until far too late. Rochelle Davis revealed her true nature within months of their marriage. The pregnancy she'd claimed turned out to be manipulation rather than fact, a lie designed to secure her position before James could realize she was nothing like the society princess her performance suggested. Her family connections existed, but meant nothing. Her father was a congressman buried under ethics violations. Her mother had been quietly asked to resign from most museum boards due to financial irregularities nobody discussed publicly, but everyone knew privately. By the time James discovered the truth about Rochelle, he was already married, and she'd made clear through her lawyer that divorce would cost him everything. She spent money like someone trying to drain an ocean with a teaspoon, buying things they didn't need with money they increasingly didn't have. James tried to control her spending, and she threatened him with public scandals. He tried to hide assets, and she found them through investigators he'd never known she'd hired. He tried to leave, and she reminded him that California was community property, and she'd take half of everything, plus support payments that would bleed him dry. Rochelle's contribution to his destruction went deeper than just her spending. She systematically introduced him to business partners who turned out to be con men running elaborate schemes. She'd met these men through her social circles, presented them as legitimate investors with impressive track records, and encouraged James to trust them with increasingly large amounts of capital. By the time James realized he'd been funding fake companies and fictional projects, millions had disappeared into offshore accounts he couldn't trace. The schemes were sophisticated enough that proving Rochelle's involvement was impossible, though looking back, James could see how she'd engineered his meetings with each con artist, how she'd vouched for their credibility, how she'd pressured him to invest quickly before opportunities disappeared. She'd been working with them from the beginning. James realized too late. The pregnancy lie, the marriage, the spending that drained his liquid assets, all of it had been coordinated to position him for maximum exploitation. When the schemes collapsed and James's wealth evaporated, Rochelle disappeared with the con artist who'd posed as a venture capitalist, taking whatever liquid assets remained and moving to another country where extradition was complicated. She'd played him perfectly, and James had been too distracted by his failing marriage to see the larger con being executed around him. His mother's interference had driven away every competent employee who'd helped build the company during its successful years. She'd inserted herself into business decisions she didn't understand, alienated clients with her superior attitude, created hostile work environments until people quit rather than tolerate her presence. James had been too weak to stand up to her, too afraid of being cut off from family entirely, too conditioned by years of her manipulation to recognize that her advice was destroying everything he'd built. The tax scandal had been the final nail in a coffin already overflowing with mistakes. Someone in his accounting department, one of Rochelle's recommended hires, had filed fraudulent returns that James hadn't caught because he'd stopped paying attention to details while drowning in chaos. The IRS didn't care that he hadn't known. They held him responsible anyway. The fines and back taxes consumed what little remained. The investigation destroyed his reputation. The possibility of criminal charges hung over his head for months before prosecutors decided he was incompetent rather than criminal and settled for bleeding him financially. His health had deteriorated alongside his finances. Stress manifested in physical symptoms requiring treatment he couldn't afford. He'd developed a condition needing ongoing medication and regular specialist appointments, and his insurance had lapsed when he could no longer afford premiums. He rationed pills and skipped appointments and hoped his body would somehow heal itself through sheer willpower. But bodies didn't work that way, and the condition worsened while his bank account emptied. The worst part wasn't the poverty itself, though poverty when you'd been wealthy felt different than poverty when you'd never known anything else. The worst part was the isolation. Friends who'd surrounded him during successful years disappeared when his money dried up. Business contacts stopped returning calls. Social invitations stopped arriving. James discovered that his entire social circle had been built on transactions rather than genuine connections. Late at night, alone in his failing apartment, James thought about Binta more than he wanted to admit. He remembered how she'd worked 3 jobs to help him build his company, how she'd sold her grandmother's ring to make his payroll, how she'd believed in him when everyone else called him a failure, how loyal she'd been until the moment he'd thrown her away with cruelty that haunted him now in ways it hadn't bothered him then. He told himself she was probably struggling somewhere, probably still poor, probably still broken from what he'd done. This thought provided strange comfort, the idea that they were both suffering, that his destruction had at least been somewhat democratic in distributing pain. His mother called on a Tuesday evening while James was sorting through bills he couldn't pay. She was breathless with excitement. She'd seen something on the news about a medical gala honoring healthcare advocates. She'd seen Binta, his ex-wife, standing on stage receiving awards beside Liam Wright, the billionaire whose wealth made James's former millions look like pocket change. His mother described Binta in detail, designed to cause maximum pain. She looked stunning, powerful, completely transformed from the broken woman who'd left with one suitcase. She was wearing diamonds that made Rochelle's jewelry look like costume pieces. She stood with confidence of someone who'd never doubted her place in the world. And Liam Wright had looked at her like she was the only woman in the world, his hand possessive and proud while she gave speeches about healthcare access with authority of someone who'd lived both sides of that equation. There were 2 small boys with them, twins. Beautiful children who looked like their mother, 3 years old, named James and Harry. Binta had built a family while James had destroyed his. She'd found love that looked real while he'd chased manipulation. She'd created an empire of compassion while his empire of ambition collapsed into rubble and regret. James sat in his failing apartment after his mother hung up and felt something break inside him that had been cracking for years. What broke was his ability to pretend that his choices hadn't mattered, that destroying Binta to chase someone else had been reasonable business of upgrading. He couldn't pretend anymore that throwing her away had been justified. He needed to see her, needed to talk to her, needed to somehow make sense of how the broken woman he'd discarded had become this powerful figure while he'd collapsed into failure. And maybe, whispered a small, desperate voice he tried to silence but couldn't quite kill, maybe she would help him. Maybe she'd give him a job. Maybe she'd cover his medical expenses. Maybe she'd be better than him, kinder than him, more forgiving. Maybe she'd save him the way he'd once refused to be saved by her. James booked a bus ticket using money he should have spent on medication and told himself he was making a reasonable decision rather than a desperate one. He told himself she would understand. He told himself that enough time had passed for wounds to heal. He told himself lies because lies were all he had left. Chapter 9. The confrontation that destroyed what remained and rebuilt what mattered. The foundation headquarters occupied the top 3 floors of a building that overlooked the city like a monument to everything Binta Wright had built from ashes, and she stood at the window of her executive office reviewing expansion plans when her assistant interrupted with an expression suggesting trouble. There was someone in the lobby, the assistant said carefully, claiming to be her ex-husband and demanding to see her immediately. Binta's first instinct was to have security remove him without conversation, but curiosity won over caution, not because she cared about James Brown, but because she wanted to prove to herself that he had no power over her anymore, that seeing him would feel like encountering a stranger rather than reliving old trauma. She agreed to 5 minutes and told her assistant to have security nearby. When James walked into her office, Binta barely recognized him. The confident millionaire had been replaced by someone who looked decades older, wearing a suit slightly too large, suggesting recent weight loss, carrying himself with desperate energy of someone who'd lost everything and was running out of options. He stared at her like he was seeing a ghost, and Binta felt nothing except mild interest in how far he'd fallen. She didn't offer him a seat, didn't offer pleasantries. She simply waited behind her massive desk, fingers steepled, expression neutral. James opened his mouth, and nothing came out for several long seconds. When he finally found his voice, he started with apologies that felt rehearsed and hollow. He told her he'd been wrong to treat her the way he had, that she hadn't deserved his cruelty, that leaving her for Rochelle had been his biggest mistake, that he'd spent years regretting his choices. Binta listened with the expression of someone hearing a moderately interesting weather report. She let him finish, then asked the only question that mattered. "Why are you here, James?" The question seemed to break something in him. He stopped performing contrition and started speaking with raw desperation. He told her about losing everything, about Rochelle's betrayal and the business failures and the tax scandal and his mother's interference. He told her about his failing health and the medical treatment he couldn't afford and the eviction notice on his counter. He told her he needed help, a job at her foundation, any position, medical assistance, anything, everything. He was begging. Binta stood slowly and walked around her desk until she was standing directly in front of him. She looked at him for a long moment, studying the ruins of someone who'd once seemed powerful enough to destroy her entire world, and when she finally spoke, her voice carried the weight of everything she'd survived. "No," she said simply. "I'm going to give you exactly what you gave me 10 years ago, James. Nothing. No help, no job, no compassion, no second chances. You threw me out with 1 suitcase and $20 and told me to go back to the gutter where I belonged. So that's what I'm telling you now. Go back to the gutter. Be grateful I'm not having security physically throw you out the way you threw me out of our marriage. Leave my building, leave my city, leave my life, and don't ever come back." Before James could respond, Binta's assistant knocked urgently and entered without waiting. There was another situation in the lobby. A woman named Rochelle Davis was causing a scene, demanding to see Binta. Binta's expression hardened into something cold and sharp. She told her assistant to bring Rochelle up immediately. When Rochelle entered, she barely acknowledged James, going straight to Binta with the same desperate energy, begging for a position at the foundation. Any job. She wasn't proud. She needed money. The man she'd left James for had kicked her out. She had nothing. Binta's carefully controlled composure cracked then, but not with sympathy. With something colder and more dangerous, the rage of someone who'd been hurt too deeply to forgive, and who'd finally been given the opportunity to make her destroyers understand exactly what they'd taken from her. "This is fascinating," she said, her voice quiet, but carrying enough intensity to make both James and Rochelle take steps backward. "The two people who destroyed my life are now standing in my office begging for scraps. The millionaire who told me I embarrassed him now needs a job from the woman he threw away. The mistress who was supposed to be everything I wasn't now needs help from the charity case she helped replace. You both taught me such valuable lessons about how people will use you and throw you away the moment you're no longer useful. I'm grateful for those lessons, truly. They made me strong enough to build this empire, but they also taught me that I don't owe forgiveness, or help, or even basic human kindness to people who proved themselves unworthy of such things." She moved toward her phone to call security, her decision made. But before she could make the call, the office door burst open, and chaos entered in the form of Liam's mother arriving with two small boys who were supposed to be at home but had apparently had their playdate end early. James and Harry ran to their mother immediately, calling for her with the unself-conscious joy of 3-year-olds who hadn't learned yet that the world could be cruel or complicated. Binta scooped up her sons automatically, her body responding to their presence even while her mind was still processing the confrontation. This was when James Brown truly saw what he'd lost, saw the children she'd had with another man, saw the empire she'd built without him, saw the life she'd created from the ashes of everything he'd destroyed. One of the twins, young James, looked at the crying stranger with concerned curiosity. "Why's that man sad, Mama?" he asked. Binta looked down at her son, then back at James Brown, and answered with simple honesty. "Sometimes people are sad because they made bad choices and have to live with the consequences. That man made choices that hurt people. And now he's learning that actions have results that can't be undone just because you regret them later." Liam's mother recognized James then, memory clicking into place from a business conference years ago where she'd witnessed him publicly humiliating Binta at a charity event, making jokes about his poor wife who didn't know which fork to use. The older woman's expression transformed from confusion to fury, and she unleashed years of protective instinct. She told James he was worth nothing compared to Binta on her worst day. That her son had waited years for Binta to trust him because she was the kind of woman worth infinite patience. That these beautiful children were being raised by two parents who actually understood what love meant. She told him his biggest failure wasn't losing his wealth or his business or his health. His biggest failure was losing Binta, and he'd been too stupid and cruel to realize it, until seeing her success made his loss impossible to deny. James's mother, who'd accompanied him, finally spoke. She'd been standing silent in the corner, watching everything unfold. She stepped forward with an expression that might have been genuine remorse. She told Binta she'd been wrong to encourage the divorce, to push James toward Rochelle, to treat Binta like she wasn't good enough for their family. She admitted her prejudice and classism. She asked for forgiveness not for James, but for herself, because carrying the knowledge of her cruelty had become too heavy. This finally broke through Binta's cold composure. She turned to James's mother with fury that had been building for a decade, her voice shaking with barely controlled rage that her sons picked up on, both boys pressing closer to her. "You don't get to ease your conscience by apologizing now," Binta said, each word sharp enough to draw blood. "You don't get to acknowledge your prejudice and cruelty and somehow make it better by admitting you were wrong. Your words and your influence contributed to the worst period of my life. You looked at me like I was garbage pretending to be human. You made me feel worthless and small and like I deserved to be thrown away. You don't get forgiveness just because guilt finally became uncomfortable. You don't get absolution just because seeing me succeed makes your past cruelty harder to justify." The office had gone completely silent, except for the sound of Binta's breathing and the small, confused noises her sons made while trying to understand why their mother was upset. Everyone waited for her next words, for the judgment she would pass. Binta looked at each of them in turn. James, broken and desperate. Rochelle, calculating even in her desperation. James's mother, performing contrition. Liam's mother, protective and fierce. And then she looked down at her sons, at James and Harry pressing close to her. "Holding on to anger gives you power you don't deserve," Binta said finally, her voice softer but no less intense. "I spent years building walls because of what you all did to me. I almost missed out on the greatest love of my life because I was too afraid to trust anyone after you taught me that trust led to destruction. But Liam and my sons taught me something more important than the lesson you tried to teach. They taught me that forgiveness isn't about excusing what people did. It's about freeing yourself from their influence. It's about refusing to let the worst moments of your past define your future." She shifted her hold on her sons, settling them more comfortably, drawing strength from their solid presence. "So I forgive you. Not because any of you deserve forgiveness. Not because I've forgotten what you did or how it felt to be destroyed by people who were supposed to love me. I forgive you because I deserve to live without your ghosts haunting me anymore. I deserve to be fully present in this beautiful life I built, instead of carrying your cruelty like weight that slows me down. I forgive you for me, not for you." She called security then, her voice steady and final, instructing them to escort James, Rochelle, and James's mother from the building and ensure they never got past the lobby again. But before security could complete that task, Binta did one final thing that proved she'd become someone completely different from who she'd been. She told her assistant to arrange for James's medical treatment to be covered through the Foundation's patient assistance program. Not because she felt anything for him. Not because she believed he deserved help, but because that was who she was now. Someone who helped people even when they didn't deserve it. Someone who broke cycles of cruelty instead of perpetuating them. Someone who understood that the best revenge wasn't making them suffer, but living so well that their suffering became completely irrelevant to her happiness. As security began escorting them out, James looked back one final time. He saw Binta holding her twins with Liam's mother's protective arm around her shoulders, standing in front of floor-to-ceiling windows that overlooked a city she'd conquered through strength and determination. She looked like royalty surveying a kingdom she'd built from nothing. She looked powerful and loved and completely untouchable. She looked like everything he'd thrown away and everything he would never have again. But Binta had already turned away from him, from Rochelle, from his mother, from the entire past that had tried so hard to define her. She focused instead on her children's laughter as they started playing with the stress ball on her desk, on the Foundation expansion plan still waiting for her review, on the text message notification from Liam saying his flight had landed early and he'd be home in an hour. She didn't spare another thought for the people being removed from her building because they'd already taken enough of her time, her energy, her emotional capacity. They were irrelevant now, background noise in a life that belonged entirely to her. When Liam arrived home that evening, he found Binta on their bedroom balcony, watching the sunset while their sons played with toy trucks behind her. She told him what had happened, about the confrontation and the forgiveness and the strange sense of completion that came from finally closing a chapter she'd thought would haunt her forever. Liam wrapped his arms around her from behind and simply held her while the sun finished setting and the first stars appeared. "I'm proud of you," he said quietly, "for being strong enough to forgive even when they didn't deserve it, for helping James with his medical treatment even after everything he did, for choosing to be better than the people who hurt you instead of letting their cruelty make you cruel." Binta leaned back against him, drawing strength from his solid presence, grateful beyond words for the patience that had given her time to heal, for the love that had proven not all relationships ended in destruction, for the partnership that had shown her what marriage was supposed to look like. "I didn't do it for them," she said. "I did it for me. For us. For James and Harry. I want our sons to grow up watching their mother choose compassion over bitterness, healing over revenge, forgiveness over perpetual anger. I want them to know that surviving hard things doesn't require becoming hard yourself." They stood together on that balcony, while the city lights came on one by one, and their son's laughter filtered through the open door, and Binta felt more at peace than she'd felt in all the years since James had first destroyed her ability to trust. The confrontation was over. The past was finally, completely, irreversibly finished, and the future stretched ahead, filled with love and purpose, and the knowledge that she'd survived the worst and built something extraordinary from the rubble. She thought briefly about James Brown sitting somewhere in his failing apartment, about whether her covering his medical treatment would mean anything to him or just feel like additional humiliation. But the thought passed quickly, replaced by the infinitely more important reality of Liam's arms around her and her son's laughter and the foundation that would open 3 more clinics next month. James's story was his own to live now. Her story was here, in this moment, in this family, in this life she'd fought so desperately hard to create and protect. The best revenge, Binta had learned, wasn't making your enemies suffer. It was living so fully and joyfully that their existence or non-existence made absolutely no difference to your happiness. And as she stood on that balcony with everything that mattered most surrounding her, she knew with absolute certainty that she'd achieved that revenge completely. She'd won not by destroying James the way he'd destroyed her, but by building something so beautiful that his destruction became irrelevant noise in the background of her extraordinary life.